Tonight's talk is based on two research papers that they were published last year, so they should be soon be available on the UCC website if you're interested in reading in more detail. And you can just search for archaeology and then my profile, and there should be a link to those papers. I haven't actually thought of that link with the Sixth Sense and I See Dead People, but it's a good one. I might use that again, and I'll credit you. But I do have a specialism within archaeology in that much of my research involves ancient human remains, and in that line of work I often encounter evidence of past violence. In fact, as those of you who are listening to that interview today will know, my very first encounter with archaeological human remains involved evidence of past violence and probably a public execution. This was when I was an undergraduate here in UCC in the 1980s, and the department got a call to say that human remains had been found at Cove Street, which is near the city centre. The remains at Cove Street turned out to be associated with the School of Anatomy that had operated on the site in the 1810s and 1820s. And one of the dissected skulls had evidence of an old healed injury to the back of the head. And prior to the Anatomy Act of 1832, one of the few legitimate sources of bodies for dissection was the gallows. Now, these could have been the remains of bodies that were robbed, but they could also have been from the gallows. But there wasn't anything to actually indicate that these were people who had been, directly indicate that these had been execution victims. So anyway, that was early on in my career, and a few years after that encounter, when I specialised in the study of human remains from archaeological sites, to be honest, I was a bit ambivalent about documenting evidence for past violence. If the truth be told, I think there was almost an embarrassment that showing an interest in the physical evidence for violence might be interpreted as some kind of unhealthy voyeurism, a kind of 1980s version of atrocity porn, which if you haven't heard about it, just think about it, it exists. There was also the worry that one was kind of feeding into a stereotype about life in the past that, to quote Hobbes, was nasty, brutish and short, and that our documenting violence in the past just reinforced a particular image of past societies as brutal, dangerous places that contrasted with the relative lawfulness of our own times. I must admit that in recent years I have lost that ambivalence and have come to view violence as a phenomenon that needs to be investigated and needs to be understood, because if for no other reason, violence or the threat of it is still often, as we can see, the means by which political power is maintained or extended. Brutal behaviour has probably always been part of the human landscape. But in tonight's talk, I want to restrict myself, I suppose, to one particular form of violent encounter. This is where violent behaviour is not a random act of wanton cruelty, even though cruelty, you'll see, is central to this, but rather something that was part of an organised spectacle. So I'm going to talk about situations where there is circumstantial, archaeological situations, where there is circumstantial evidence that violent acts form parts of public performances that were designed to punish perceived wrongdoers, but also these acts were loaded with symbolism and were designed to convey very particular messages of revenge, deterrence and retribution to the victims and also to the onlookers. Most of my data are from Dublin, where, based on the nature of the remains and their contexts, I would argue that these represent instances of what we might call state-sanctioned violence, acts that were authorized and endorsed by those who exercise political power in that settlement. The first cases that I want to show with you, or share with you, are from among the human skeletal remains that were recovered during the Wood Quay series of excavations that were undertaken by the National Museum starting in the 1970s and finishing in the early 1980s. As you might know, This series of excavations in the Viking Age colony at Dublin have provided very detailed, even intimate insights into the daily lives of its inhabitants between the 10th and the 13th centuries AD. Human remains were actually a very common find on these sites, and excuse me, these remains were not studied at the time, but I've been working on this assemblage for the past couple of years. And the human remains from Wood Quay were not from formal graveyards. Rather, most of the 10th and 11th century remains were associated with a succession of 3 earthen banks that were constructed along what was then the river frontage along the Liffey. And most of the remains found in association with these banks consisted of isolated human skulls, most of them belonging to males. And many of these skulls had evidence of some kind of what we call perimortem trauma. Injuries occurred or incurred at the time of death, and many of these injuries included evidence of sharp force trauma, so something cutting wounds basically. And there was also some evidence of sharp instruments having been passed through some of these heads. This skull has a number of cutting wounds. This one is on display in Kildare Street in the National Museum. So it has evidence of cutting wounds, but it was also probably impaled on some kind of a sharp object that has actually penetrated through the top of the skull. So as I say, these remains were directly associated with the banks that surrounded the settlement. And I've suggested that they were the remains of heads, trophy heads, that may have been displayed on the town ramparts and sometime later came to be buried at the bases of these various banks. Now, one of the questions that these remains begged was, you know, who were these men and why did their heads end up on the ramparts of the town? To answer that question, we sent samples of some of these individuals for stable isotope analysis. And we use isotopic analysis to track mobility in the past, but also to get an idea of ancient diets. And bone is a living tissue that remodels throughout the life of the individual. And the isotopic signatures of, let's say, take an element like strontium, the isotopic ratios of strontium will reflect the underlying geology of the region in which the person lived for the last few years of their lives. Now, with the Wood Quay material, we first had to define what were the isotopic ratios that we would expect to find given the local geology, and we did this by sampling bones of pigs from the same sites. Pigs are omnivorous, and they tend to eat the leftovers, if you like, from the human diet. They have a very similar diet to humans. They're also unlikely to have been imported large distances. And what we found once we looked at these isotopic signatures is that all of the pigs clustered very closely together in terms of the ratios of that one particular element, strontium. And this is what you would expect if they were from one particular area. And this also gave us a baseline, if you like, a range of the strontium levels that we would expect from local people or from people who are local to the Dublin area. When we compare the pig bone signatures to those of human bone, as you can see here, all of the human bone levels were within the range established from the pigs. So, as I say, the pigs provided the baseline against which to judge the human bone. And these results suggest that all of the humans that we sampled, these heads associated with the banks, that these men had lived in Dublin or near Dublin for many years prior to their deaths, for years and perhaps decades. So the individuals then whose heads ended up on the banks around the settlement at Dublin were inhabitants of the town, or they lived in the hinterland. All lived in that region, as I say, for years or decades prior to their deaths. And I think what we are looking at here is the display of remains of people from within the town who somehow got on the wrong side of the ruling elite. Now, I'll return to these Viking Age heads later on. Dublin, of course, was the capital of the English colony in Ireland after the Viking Age period. And compared to the Viking Age town, we have a much richer historical archive for the Anglo-Norman town. In particular, we have, in terms of legal documents, we have the justiciary rolls, which contain accounts of the court rulings of the English colony in Ireland. And these court rulings listed hanging as the standard punishment for crimes that ranged from stealing to murder. Offences against the crown, treason, were considered to be more serious, and they had to have an appropriately worse penalty than hanging. And that usually involved prolonging the suffering of the prisoner. So throughout the Middle Ages, and indeed right up until the early 19th century here, those convicted of treason were sentenced to be hanged, drawn and quartered. And this penalty followed a standard, you could say, ritualized procedure. And as was the case with most executions up until the 19th century, this vivisection was carried out in public. The victim was castrated and disemboweled, with the entrails and genitals being burned in front of them while they were potentially still living. One would hope that they were not, but there was that potential. They were then decapitated, and the torso was cut into 4 portions or quarters. And the head and the quarters were then mounted on the city walls or in other prominent places. Let me show you a second archaeological assemblage of remains that seem to be related to this behaviour. Excavations along the lines of the medieval walls of Dublin at places such as Isolde's Tower there and Essex Street West. These are both just down the street from the Olympia Theatre, just to kind of orientate yourselves. These excavations at these 2 sites have produced portions of skulls and other human remains. Isolde's Tower there this is the drum at the base of the tower on excavation. This was actually preserved in situ, so you can see this through a grille in the apartment block that now sits on top of it. But Isolde's Tower was located at, as you can see there, the northeastern corner of the town. It overlooked the seaward approaches to Dublin, and it would have been the first portion of the city that anybody approaching well, I suppose the town maybe rather than the city. It would have been, the walled town was probably about the same size as St. Stephen's Green, or a little bit bigger. But anybody approaching the town defences from the sea, this tower would have been the first thing that they would have encountered. And during the excavation at the foot of the tower and the adjacent town wall, the remains of at least 5 males again were found, including portions of at least 4 skulls, as well as portions of a right arm and a left arm. None of the limb bones had any cut marks, but 2 of the crania had injuries that were consistent with decapitation. This is a mandible with a glancing wound to the angle of the mandible, which is the kind of thing that occurs with decapitation. A third cranium had evidence of violence, including a cutting wound, and this was a perimortem injury, so something that was incurred at the time of death, but there was no direct evidence of decapitation on that particular skull. And then the remains from further along the city wall at Essex Street West also have similar cuts that were inflicted at the time of death and are consistent with decapitation. So you can see again a glancing blow to the back of the temporal, the mastoid process there in the top photograph, and then 3 separate cuts to a cervical vertebra of the neck. And you've probably all heard the story of the botched execution of Mary, Queen of Scots, where the axemen had to strike a number of times. And we're looking at some similar scenario here with this neck bone or cervical vertebra. So the combination and nature of the injuries and their context suggests that these remains represent body parts that were once displayed on the city walls. And we have plenty of pictorial evidence of this practice from the period. This is one of a series of woodcuts published in 1581, so it's from just towards the end of the medieval period in Ireland, and it shows the Lord Deputy Henry Sidney leaving Dublin Castle in the 1570s to campaign against the rebel Irish. This is a work of propaganda, and it shows the heads of 3 men mounted on spikes over the gates of the castle. All of the illustrations in this particular series were accompanied by verse, and the one accompanying this particular image states, as you can see here, their trunkless heads do plainly show each rebel's fatal end, and what a heinous crime it is the Queen for to offend. Now, in both the Viking Age and the 16th century context that I've shown you here, I don't think it's an accident that the evidence for dismembering and decapitation occurs in a location that was a center of social and political power. The public ritualized violence and the subsequent display of body parts was clearly one means by which power was exercised within these societies. So maybe the label state-sanctioned violence that I mentioned at the outset is a bit of an understatement here, because it implies a kind of passive role in this. Rather than being passive, I would suggest that extreme violence carried out in public and the display of its aftermath in a highly visible fashion was a strategy used by rulers to maintain and extend their control. There's also a patterning to the location of the remains within the center of power. The heads and body parts tend to occur on the boundaries, as we've seen with the Viking remains and also those from Isolde's Tower and Essex Street West. We can see the same thing in this 17th century depiction of the city of Cork. The display of heads, again in these boundary or liminal spots. And I think placing the remains in boundary locations like this would have amplified the visual messages sent to those both inside and outside the settlement, while also reinforcing the symbolic exclusion from society of those whose body parts were on display. So I'm suggesting then that these archaeological assemblages do not represent random acts of cruelty and violence, rather that they represent the product of ritualized executions, what we might call, to refer to my title, performative violence. The French philosopher Michel Foucault took an example of this kind of brutality as his starting point for a discussion of the development of the modern prison system in his 1975 work, Discipline and Punish. This was the execution in 1757 of Robert François Damiens, who had attempted to assassinate Louis XV. Foucault saw his 18th century example as being a leftover from the medieval period, where the presence of an audience was a kind of crucial component of punishment, which was a spectacle acted out by those in power. According to Foucault, the principal aim of this deadly theatre was the punishment of the physical body with the aim of avenging the crime. The original offence was an injury to the body politic, so this was avenged by harming the body of the culprit. So in public executions, the body was acted on and displayed in a deliberately horrific manner. And what we're looking at in the archaeological remains, the mounting, or the remains of heads and body parts that were mounted on structures like Dublin Castle and Isolde's Tower, this is just the culmination of a whole process of public degradation, torture, and vivisection that involved a very strong element of public performance, laced, as I said, with symbolism. In the case of hanging, drawing, and quartering, the end result was the destruction at a number of levels of where the person, if you like, was transformed into something that was obviously physically dead, but they were also socially and spiritually dead. As this was the punishment for treason, the victim was usually a member of the society in question, an insider. Their transformation from insider to outsider literally involved taking their insides out in a manner that was designed to cause the greatest horror. The destruction extended beyond the individual, actually, the individual culprit, if you like, on the gallows. The castration of the victim, while being part of the torture and the physical destruction of the living person, also symbolized that the traitor's lineage was damned. The relatives, for example, of the regicide Damien in 1757 were forbidden for using that surname forevermore. Here in Ireland, we have examples of people hanged, drawn, and quartered for treason, where the families of those convicted of treason were often dispossessed of their lands. So the symbolic damnation extended beyond the individual. And at a time when the monarch's rule was understood to be based on divine right, king by the grace of God, the anointed of God, there was a clear understanding that the souls of those who offended the monarch were damned. Also at a time when most people would have accepted the concept of a bodily resurrection, the physical separation of the body parts also amplified the eternal damnation, if you like, for the soul of the executed individual, and must have added a further level of anguish for them and for those close to them. Mounting heads and body parts on the town ramparts ensured the continued social memory of the individual, but in a particularly nasty way. The nasty and corrupt nature of the decaying remains was, if you like, a reminder not of their lives, but of the fate of their souls. The display of the body parts, as I say, placed the emphasis on the crime, on the execution, and on the eternal damnation of the soul, rather than on the living person. And of course, this acted as a very stark warning to others of the consequences of offending those in power. Now, torture and execution as spectacle diminished during the 18th century and into the early 19th. And Michel Foucault argued for a fundamental change in attitudes to punishment at the time that involved a shift away, if you like, from the idea of punishment as spectacle, where the presence of onlookers or an audience was a crucial component. And he linked this change, this move, if you like, away from public executions and executions generally and torture and vivisection. He linked this change to a change in attitudes to the body and to the soul. The physical demolition of the human body was central to performative violence. The move from public executions then to long-term incarceration in prison meant that the body was acted on in a fundamentally different way. Physical torture was replaced by a system in which the body was subjected instead to surveillance and regulation with the intention of rehabilitation. So while the body was still central to punishment, the ultimate aim changed from being the punishment of the body and retribution to rehabilitation and the reform of the soul. And in fact, Foucault's 1975 volume is as much about the nature of the soul as it is about the prison system. He argued that the conceptualization of the soul changed in the early modern period in the 18th century with the Enlightenment, and that this was related to the development of the human sciences. In other words, the rational and systematic investigation of the nature of human life, all of this that arose out of the Enlightenment. And for Foucault, the modern Western concept of soul is a product of the human sciences and the associated methods of examination and observation. He argued that ideas such as people having a conscience, the individual psyche, and even the concept of good behavior, he argued that these are constructs that were created by the human sciences and the particular regime of power and knowledge that they produced. So for Michel Foucault, the move from performative violence, with its central focus on the public, ceremonial, physical destruction of the body of the prisoner, to the regulation of the, didn't mean to do that, to the regulation of the life of the prisoner away from the public gaze, he argues that this reveals much about the worldview of post-Enlightenment Europe, while also telling us about the relationships of power and knowledge in Western society. And for him, prisons such as Cork City Jail here are not marginal places in our societies, but they are central places. He argued that the same strategies of power and knowledge operate in prison and outside prison. The mechanisms of surveillance, regulation, and discipline that controlled convicts in the 19th and into the 20th century, that these are also adaptable for use elsewhere in society. And prisons from this period are arranged to maximize surveillance of, or the threat of surveillance of prisoners by a relatively small staff. And Cork City Jail is a good exemplar of this particular design. This idea of the kind of changing conceptualization of the soul and the relationship with punishment regimes brings me back to the first human remains that I excavated, those that I mentioned at the outset from the 19th century medical school. For Foucault, in the post-Enlightenment era, coercion and other traditional means of maintaining power were gradually replaced by what one writer has called the new agencies of rationalism, science and medicine within the framework of modern capitalism. In common with other areas of life, such as healthcare and death, punishment was taken over by what were called men of science as a form of social control. Punishment moved from the public gaze to something that was regulated by experts within prison walls. Foucault also saw this as something related to the ambiguity of the role of the audience or the crowd at public executions. The crowd could be swayed to have sympathy for the prisoner, and that creates a potential political problem for those in power. And that potential political problem was removed by eliminating or at least controlling the composition of the audience. Public torture and vivisection gave way to what were considered more humane methods of punishment. Though we may not think of it in those terms now, the guillotine was introduced as a means of ridding punishment of its element of torture. It was mercifully quick in comparison to what preceded it. In France and in much of the rest of Europe, prior to the introduction of the guillotine, the most severe form of punishment was known as breaking on the wheel. This is a depiction of a series of executions that were carried out near Lisbon in 1759. And the victims of the executions here are an aristocratic family who were accused of trying to assassinate the King of Portugal. This was the continental European version of hanging, drawing, and quartering, in that breaking at the wheel was reserved for aggravated crimes. It was also used occasionally here in Ireland and also in Britain, and it was infamously used here for the officers during the 1580 massacre of Spanish and Papal troops at Dunanore in Smerwick Harbour, where one of the people charged with the massacre was the man later becomes Sir Walter Raleigh. Breaking on the wheel involved shattering each of the bones of the limbs one by one. And in the Portuguese example depicted here, the entire family was executed. The figure at the center was the old Duchess who was mercifully beheaded, but all of the male members of the family were broken at the wheel, and then some young daughters were spared and sent to a convent. But after this, and then the scaffolding, the entire scaffold was burned subsequently, as you can see depicted here. In this particular example, not only was the entire family wiped out, their house was demolished. The land where the house had stood was covered with salt to prevent anything growing on the site, and a law was passed forbidding anything to be built in that location forevermore. So again, like the examples that I mentioned earlier, this is not just about killing the alleged conspirators, but it's also aimed at damning them, their lineage, and their memory for all time. And this particular incident was used politically by the Prime Minister of the day to augment his own power and to smash the power of the aristocracy. And it worked. Nobody dared oppose the Marquês de Pombal after this particular event. Now, in Ireland and Britain, the penalty of hanging, drawing, and quartering remained on the statute books until as recently as 1870, which is not that long ago. Well, for an archaeologist, that's very recent. Anyway, it was on the statute books till 1870, but in practice, as I've already mentioned, by the end of the 18th century, the appetite for public torture had diminished. And that's very much apparent in this image that I showed earlier, the execution of Robert Emmet in 1803. And Emmet had been sentenced to be hanged, drawn, and quartered, but instead he was hanged and his dead body was then beheaded, and they left it at that. So we can see that, that there's a kind of metamorphosis going on here. And that metamorphosis is an interesting one because the public display of body parts of those accused of serious crime had metamorphosed, if you like, in ways that affected others other than people executed for treason, like Robert Emmet. Instead of placing heads on spikes at the city gates, which was actually done right into the very early 1800s. But instead of that practice, bodies were increasingly, as we move from the 1700s into the 1800s, bodies were increasingly given over to medical schools for dissection, hence the remains that I started out with this evening. And as we've seen, this remained the only legitimate source of anatomy cadavers or bodies for dissection until the Anatomy Act of 1832. And in keeping with Foucault's idea about the role of science and strategies of control in post-Enlightenment Western Europe, the bodies of the executed now became available for intimate scrutiny and destruction away from the public gaze. However, old habits died hard, and the ritualized, state-sanctioned destruction of bodies resurfaced in a modified form, carried out by the new guardians of the political order, men of science. For some crimes that were regarded as particularly heinous, judges could include a stipulation that the execution was followed by anatomical dissection and that this dissection should be carried out in public. And this is an engraving from 1751 by William Hogarth that illustrates an instance of public dissection. And I think the motivation and the social understanding of this particular event and its public nature are best summarized in the first and last lines of the verses that you can probably just barely see there at the base of the print. Let me read those for you. First verse says, "Behold the villain's dire disgrace, nor not death itself can end. He finds no peaceful burial place, his breathless corpse no friend. his heart exposed to prying eyes, to pity has no claim, but dreadful from his bones shall rise his monument of shame. Now, I think while Foucault's perspective is a very interesting one, and it is very compelling when we compare the high medieval and this early 19th century example of remains from anatomical schools and so on, I think that it's also an interesting lens. It might also be of relevance when we look back at the Viking Age and the early medieval period that I mentioned at the outset tonight. We've seen how the banks surrounding Viking Age Dublin were used to display the heads of victims of execution. And I think it's also interesting to look at what was happening on contemporary indigenous sites away from the immigrant Norse. A number of elite level sites from this period have produced skeletal remains in contexts that might indicate that they were on display. This has been reported primarily at sites that were of a strategic nature, like, say, Lagore, County Meath here, or one of my favourite sites, this place, Carracomon in County Clare. And quite a few of these elite level sites have produced skulls with evidence of decapitation. Now, I will admit that there are issues here about the dating of some of these remains, because both of these excavations that I've showed you are quite old. They were carried out in the 1930s. But at Carracomon, for example, the human remains were concentrated just inside that large inner rampart that you can see in this photograph, while at Lagore, the largest concentration of remains was just outside the surrounding palisade. And when these sites were excavated in the 1930s, the excavator was the same man in both sites. He made passing references to the possible use of skulls for display, but basically very little attention has been paid to that suggestion subsequently. And I think part of the reason why it was overlooked was that he made somewhat fanciful suggestions about behavior at Carracomon, including the possibility of cannibalism, and that tended to push his arguments into the kind of lunatic fringe, and they tended to be overlooked. But as I say, I think he was onto something in terms of talking about these skulls for display. So then we have a lack, if you like, of archaeological attention being paid to this possible early medieval indigenous Irish examples of head taking. And what's interesting about that is it contrasts with the attention paid to the taking of heads in the contemporary literature, in the annals and the other literature of the time, which contain many references to decapitations and heads being kept as trophies. The annals and the Dín Seanachas contain accounts of enemies being dishonoured by post-mortem head taking. In other words, the individuals were killed and the head was taken subsequently. However, there are also references to severed heads being treated with considerable respect and even affection. There are tales in the Dín Seanachas, for example, in which heads can speak, eat and sing. And from the literature, it's clear that the concept of the display of severed human heads was one that was familiar in early medieval Ireland. It's also clear that the severed head provided a means of gaining power over one's enemies. And there are references to the taker of a head further emphasizing this gaining of power over one's enemies by placing the skull between his thighs and sleeping in this position, a kind of sexual innuendo, if you like, brought into this particular behavior. And these are, or maybe that's my reading, scratch that last line. Anyway, these and similar references have been interpreted as indicating that to the early medieval Irish, the taking of a head implied robbing the enemy of his essence and thereby dominating and controlling his spirit. And this is perhaps an oversimplification, as there are indications of a diversity of meanings that varied according to context, and this could account for the singing, eating and speaking, as well as the domination of enemies post-mortem. As I mentioned, the taker of the skull was often depicted as having a respectful attitude to the head, which through its singing and talking could occasionally be a source of hidden knowledge. So we have these heads being portrayed almost as oracles. And by ascribing the abilities of oracle to the dismembered head, there's a suggestion that in at least some circumstances, the head was perceived as a potential source of power. Now, of course, the early medieval literature is open to multiple interpretations, but there seems to be a clear message there of the intrinsic power held by the human head. And I find it very tempting to relate this to Irish church architecture of the 12th century, where the disembodied head is a dominant motif, often interpreted as indicating an understanding of the head as a seat of the soul. There's also suggestion that the motif of the singing and talking disembodied head was borrowed from the early medieval Irish literature by the compilers of the Norse sagas. So it might be a case that the cultural understanding of the heads displayed around Viking Age Dublin was something that may have been borrowed from the neighbours rather than typical of Norse behaviour. So if we accept Foucault's theoretical approach, then perhaps what we are looking at here with all of these different archaeological examples of heads that I would argue were used for display are different conceptualizations of the body and soul and the impact of different regimes of power and knowledge operating on individual bodies. According to Foucault's scheme, we are the inheritors of the more rational approach that he argued emerged after the Enlightenment, when the soul replaced the body as the focus of punishment. He interprets the medieval approach to performative violence or violence as spectacle as focused on punishing the body while also sending strong messages about the power of elite groups. I think we could interpret the medieval literature as suggesting a greater degree of elision between body and soul in that particular cultural context, and that in some situations at least the separation between body and soul is not as clear-cut as Foucault seems to envisage. So to wrap up then, I hope that you can see that the study of past violence is not a voyeuristic exercise in reconstructing images of gore from the Middle Ages or other periods, and thereby comforting ourselves about how humankind has progressed. Violence has probably always been an integral part of human affairs, and many societies attempt to solve their perceived problems through conflict and atrocity. Brutal regimes of punishment have been, and indeed continue to be, features of many political settings. These are culturally determined acts that have motivations and intent beyond the destructions of individuals. And while they may while they may be about the maintenance and extension of political power, they also have the potential to reveal attitudes to bodies and souls. Thank you.